What happens when a man who has spent 50 years being told he's finished, washed up, too old, and irrelevant finally sits across from someone who decides to prove all those critics right on live television? What you're about to witness is one of the most explosive confrontations ever captured on daytime TV. The moment when Sylvester Stallone, the man who created Rocky Balboa and taught the world what it means to never give up, was pushed to his absolute breaking point by a host who thought she could tear down a legend. The studio went silent, the audience held their breath, and what happened next would be talked about for years to come. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments because, trust me, you're going to have a lot to say about this one. The morning had started with the usual chaos of a live television production. Sylvester Stallone arrived at the View Studios in Manhattan with his characteristic punctuality, a habit he had developed over 5 decades in an industry that waited for no one. At 77 years old, he still carried himself with the physical presence that had made him an icon, his frame still powerful, his handshake still firm enough to make younger men wince. In the green room, his publicist reviewed the talking points one final time. They were there to promote his latest directorial project, a passion piece he had been developing for over a decade. The film was deeply personal, a meditation on legacy, mortality, and what it means to keep fighting when the world tells you to stop. It was exactly the kind of project that should have generated thoughtful conversation about art, aging, and the human spirit. What nobody anticipated was that Joy Behar had walked into the studio that morning with an entirely different agenda. The studio lights were hot as Stallone took his seat at the famous table. He adjusted his collar slightly, a nervous habit that had survived 50 years of interviews, press junkets, and public appearances. The audience gave him a warm welcome, many of them old enough to remember seeing Rocky in theaters when it first changed the landscape of American cinema. Whoopi Goldberg opened the segment with genuine enthusiasm. Our next guest is truly a legend. He created one of the most iconic characters in film history, and 50 years later, he's still going strong. Please welcome the one and only Sylvester Stallone. The applause was thunderous. Stallone waved to the audience with that familiar crooked smile, the one that had graced movie posters around the world. Thank you. It's great to be here. I've been a fan of this show for a long time. Sarah Haynes asked the first question about his new project, and Stallone leaned forward with visible passion. His voice, that distinctive gravelly instrument that had delivered some of cinema's most memorable lines, filled the studio as he described his vision for the film. "You know, this project has been with me for over 10 years, he explained, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. It's about a man who's been told his whole life that he's not smart enough, not talented enough, not young enough. And he just keeps going anyway, because that's what fighters do. They don't quit just because someone tells them to." The audience was engaged, nodding along with his words. This was the Stallone they had come to see, the underdog philosopher who had turned his own struggles into art that inspired millions. For a few minutes, everything felt exactly as it should. Then Joy Behar leaned forward with that familiar predatory glint in her eyes, and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. "So, Sly," Joy began, deliberately using the casual nickname without invitation, "you talk about fighters not quitting. But at some point, doesn't not quitting become not knowing when to quit? You're 77 years old. Don't you think it's time to step aside and let younger filmmakers have their turn?" The question landed like a punch to the gut. The audience went silent. The other hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances. Stallone's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed what had just been said to him on live television. "I'm not sure I understand the question, Joy," he replied carefully, his voice still controlled, but now carrying an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Are you suggesting that creativity has an expiration date? That artists should just disappear once they reach a certain age?" Joy waved her hand dismissively, a gesture that seemed designed to minimize his response. "I'm suggesting that there's something a little sad about watching aging action stars cling to their glory days. Rocky was great, Rambo was great, but that was 40, 50 years ago. At what point does continuing to make these movies become less about art and more about ego?" Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sunny Hostin looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Even Whoopi, who had seen her share of controversial moments on the show, seemed taken aback by the directness of Joy's attack. Stallone took a breath, visibly centering himself before responding. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of a man who had spent his entire life fighting against exactly this kind of dismissal. "Hey Joy, I grew up in Hell's Kitchen. My father told me I'd never amount to anything. I have a paralysis in part of my face from a birth complication that made people assume I was slow, stupid. Every casting director in Hollywood told me I'd never be a leading man. I was homeless, sleeping in a bus station when I wrote Rocky. And you want to talk to me about knowing when to quit?" The response was powerful, delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that had made his performances so memorable. But Joy inexplicably pressed forward. "That's a great origin story, and I'm sure it served you well over the years. But my point stands. You keep making the same movies, playing the same characters. Rocky, Rambo, The Expendables. It's all just recycled nostalgia at this point, isn't it? You're selling people their own memories instead of creating anything new." The accusation was pointed and cruel, designed to undermine decades of creative work. Stallone's jaw tightened, and those who knew him well could see the famous temper beginning to stir beneath his controlled exterior. "Recycled nostalgia?" His voice had dropped to a dangerous register. "Is that what you call it when an artist returns to characters that mean something to people? When Shakespeare wrote sequels to his histories, was that recycled nostalgia? When painters return to the same subjects throughout their careers, is that a lack of creativity?" Joy laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Did you really just compare yourself to Shakespeare? That's exactly the kind of ego I'm talking about. You're an action movie star, Sly. Let's not pretend you're creating high art here." The dismissal was so complete, so deliberately belittling, that several people in the audience actually gasped. Alyssa Farrah Griffin's eyes went wide. Sarah Haynes looked at her notes, clearly wishing she could be anywhere else. The tension in the studio had become almost unbearable. Stallone leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice had taken on a quality that anyone who had seen his films would recognize. It was the voice of a man who had been pushed to his limit and was no longer interested in playing nice. "Let me tell you something about action movies, Joy. Let me tell you what those films mean to people." His eyes never left her face. "I get letters every single week from people who tell me that Rocky saved their life, that watching that character get up off the canvas one more time gave them the strength to keep fighting their own battles. Cancer patients, veterans with PTSD, kids from broken homes who had no one believing in them. Those movies aren't just entertainment. They're survival guides for people who feel like the world has counted them out." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? You sit at this table every day making clever comments, tearing people down for entertainment. You've never created anything that made someone feel less alone in the world. You've never given anyone hope. You just criticize the people who do." The counterattack was devastating. Joy's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of something that might have been anger or might have been shame. But she recovered quickly, her defensive instincts taking over. "I'm a journalist, Sly. My job is to ask the tough questions, not to coddle celebrities who can't handle criticism." "Tough questions?" Stallone's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You haven't asked a single tough question. A tough question would be asking about the craft of filmmaking after 50 years. A tough question would be asking how I approach aging as an action star, what physical challenges I face, how I've had to adapt my style. Those are questions that might actually produce interesting answers. What you've asked is designed to humiliate, not illuminate." Joy crossed her arms defensively. "I'm simply pointing out what a lot of people are thinking, that maybe it's time for some of these legacy actors to step aside and make room for fresh talent. That's not an attack. That's an observation about the industry." "An observation?" Stallone stood up from his chair, his full height commanding attention in a way that made the studio feel smaller. "Let me make an observation about you, Joy. You've been doing this show for how many years now? 25? 30? By your own logic, shouldn't you have stepped aside by now to make room for younger voices? Or does your rule about making room only apply to other people?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Joy's face flushed red, and for a moment she seemed genuinely speechless. The other hosts were frozen in their seats, clearly unsure whether to intervene or let this confrontation run its course. "That's different," Joy finally managed. "I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. I'm not running around trying to convince people I can still do what I did 30 years ago. No, you're just running around convincing yourself that tearing down other people's work makes you relevant. Stallone's voice was rising now, decades of frustration beginning to pour out. You want to talk about pretending? Let's talk about pretending. Pretending that asking cruel questions is the same as journalism. Pretending that cynicism is the same as intelligence. Pretending that you have any authority to judge the value of someone else's creative work when you've never risked anything to create something yourself. The audience was absolutely still. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath, capturing every moment of what was clearly becoming a historic television confrontation. Joy tried to regain her footing. I think you're being oversensitive. I asked a legitimate question about aging in Hollywood, and you've turned it into a personal attack. I've turned it into a personal attack? Stallone moved closer to the desk, his presence dominating the space. You called my work recycled nostalgia. You suggested I should disappear because of my age. You compared my creative output unfavorably to high art while dismissing 50 years of films that have meant something to millions of people. And I'm the one making personal attacks? He shook his head slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something quieter, but somehow more powerful. You know what I think this is really about, Joy? I think you look at someone like me, someone who refuses to quit, who keeps creating, who won't just fade away quietly like you think they should, and it makes you uncomfortable. Because my existence is a reminder that age doesn't have to mean irrelevance. That passion doesn't have to die just because your body gets older. And that threatens whatever narrative you've built about what people like me are supposed to do. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Stallone held up his hand with an authority that silenced her. No, you've had your turn to talk. You've had your turn to question my relevance, my creativity, my right to continue doing what I love. Now, you're going to listen. He turned to face the audience, then back to Joy, his eyes carrying the intensity that had made him a star. I wrote Rocky when I was 29 years old. I was broke. I was desperate. Every studio wanted to buy the script, but they all wanted to cast someone else, someone more handsome, someone more articulate, someone who fit their idea of what a movie star should look like. And I said no. I turned down hundreds of thousands of dollars because I believed in myself when no one else did. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. That movie won Best Picture. It launched a franchise that's still going strong almost 50 years later. It created a character that has become a symbol of perseverance around the world. And you sit there and tell me it was just nostalgia? That continuing to develop that character, to find new stories to tell within that universe, is somehow a sign that I don't know when to quit? Joy tried to interrupt. I'm just saying that at some point, what? Stallone's voice boomed through the studio. At some point I should just accept that people like you think I'm finished? At some point I should stop creating because it makes critics uncomfortable that I won't go away. Let me tell you something about at some point. At some point everyone said my career was over. They said it after Rocky V flopped. They said it when action movies fell out of fashion. They said it when I turned 60, then 70. And every single time, I proved them wrong. He was pacing now, his energy filling the studio, in a way that commanded everyone's attention. You know what the difference is between people like you and people like me, Joy? When I fail, I get back up. When I get knocked down, I figure out how to get back on my feet. That's what Rocky is about. That's what my whole career is about. It's not about being the best. It's not about winning every fight. It's about refusing to stay down when life hits you. And I'm not going to apologize for embodying that principle just because it makes you uncomfortable. Whoopi finally attempted to intervene. Maybe we should take a breath here But Stallone wasn't finished. The dam had broken, and decades of biting his tongue, of smiling through dismissive interviews, of being polite to people who belittled his work were finally coming to the surface. No, Whoopi. With all respect, this needs to be said. He turned back to Joy. You sit here every day with a platform that reaches millions of people. You have the power to celebrate creativity, to highlight perseverance, to inspire people who are struggling. And instead, you use that platform to tear down a 77-year-old man for having the audacity to still believe in himself. His voice cracked slightly with emotion. Do you have any idea how many young people I meet who are afraid to pursue their dreams because they've been told they're too old, too late, too whatever? Do you have any idea what it means to them when they see someone like me still fighting, still creating, still refusing to give up? That's not ego joy, that's responsibility. That's using whatever platform you have to show people that it's never too late to keep going. Joy's defensive posture had softened slightly, but she made one more attempt to justify her position. I was just asking questions that people are curious about. It's not my fault if you can't handle them. Stallone stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression that mixed disappointment with something that might have been pity. You know what's sad, Joy? You had an opportunity today. You had a chance to have a real conversation about aging, about creativity, about what it means to keep pursuing your passion when the world tells you to stop. You could have asked about the physical challenges of making action movies in your 70s. You could have asked about how my perspective on the characters I've created has evolved over time. You could have asked about what I want my legacy to be. He shook his head slowly. Instead, you chose to be dismissive. You chose to reduce 50 years of work to recycled nostalgia. You chose to suggest that I should disappear to make room for other people. And in doing so, you revealed exactly what kind of person you are. Someone who would rather tear down than build up. Someone who thinks cruelty is the same as insight. Someone who has never understood that the most important thing in life isn't what you achieve. It's refusing to give up on what you believe in. The silence that followed was absolute. Joy sat in her chair, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. The other hosts stared at their hands, clearly processing what they had just witnessed. Stallone straightened his jacket and addressed the camera directly, speaking not to Joy, not to the hosts, but to everyone watching at home. To anyone out there who's been told they're too old, too late, too anything to pursue their dreams, I want you to hear this. The people who tell you to give up are almost always people who gave up on themselves a long time ago. They want you to quit because your persistence makes them uncomfortable. Don't give them that satisfaction. Keep fighting, keep creating, keep getting up every time life knocks you down, because that's what it means to be alive. Not just existing, but fighting for something you believe in. He turned back to Joy one final time. I feel sorry for you, Joy. I genuinely do, because somewhere along the way, you decided that being clever was more important than being kind, that getting a reaction was more important than having a real conversation, that tearing people down was easier than building something yourself. And now, here you are, sitting at this table, surrounded by people who are afraid to disagree with you, wondering why a 77-year-old man who refuses to quit makes you so angry. He paused, letting the words settle before delivering his final thought. The answer is simple. I make you angry because I'm proof that everything you believe about giving up and stepping aside and making room is wrong. I'm proof that age doesn't have to mean irrelevance. And that scares you. Because if I'm right, then what's your excuse? With that, Sylvester Stallone walked off the stage with the same determination that had defined his entire career. The audience sat in stunned silence. The cameras kept rolling, capturing Joy Behar sitting alone at the table, looking like someone who had just been knocked out in a fight she thought she was winning. What had started as a promotional interview for a new film had become something else entirely, a masterclass in what happens when you push a fighter too far, a demonstration of the difference between someone who creates and someone who criticizes, a moment that would be replayed and discussed for years to come. And as the studio fell into uncomfortable silence, one thing was absolutely clear. The Italian stallion had faced another challenger, absorbed every punch, and once again proven that he was never, ever going to stay down. What do you think about this incredible confrontation? Was Joy Behar out of line, or was she just doing her job? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that will absolutely leave you speechless.